They were last seen as the sun cracked over the frost-lined ridges of Mount Shasta, two distant figures outlined in pale orange light, climbing steadily along a trail that had, for generations, drawn dreamers and vanished them in equal measure. Their movements were slow but deliberate, the stride of seasoned mountaineers who had studied this route for years. Elena Maddox led slightly ahead, her frame compact and efficient, every motion tuned by years of alpine experience. Behind her, Hale moved with calm precision, taller, broader, carrying most of the gear without complaint. Below them, the pine forest receded into shadow, a final soft place before the earth gave way to rock and wind and silence. Their boots cut narrow indentations into the hardened path scars in the white crust of early October ice, and then the trail turned, and they were gone. No radio call, no flare, no dropped gear, not even a panicked message on the satellite beacon. The disappearance wasn't loud. It was the opposite, eerily quiet, vanishing so clean it felt like an edit in a film reel, one frame present, the next absent, nothing in between. For days afterward, the mountain was scoured by boots and rotor blades, dogs and heat sensors, but it offered only wind, not a thread of clothing, not a snapped branch. Search teams returned hollow-eyed, their maps lined with check marks in dead zones. The families waited, then hoped, then began to wither. The names of the climbers circulated online, their faces spreading across forums and local news clips like candle flames at a vigil. Elena, with her glacier blue eyes and fierce curiosity, and Peter, whose easy laugh had once filled the parking lots of trailheads across the Cascades, they became folklore almost overnight. People spoke of them with the same hushed reverence reserved for the vanished, not the dead, not yet, but no longer among the living, just gone, with all the weight that word could carry. 9 winters came and went, each one burying more than snow. What began as a search turned into a theory, then a memory, and finally a silence so complete it seemed ordained. Until the mountain blinked. It was a bright, arid day in July when the lens on a state mapping helicopter caught something that should not have been there. The mission had nothing to do with missing persons. It was a bureaucratic task scanning erosion patterns for spring runoff reports. The pilot, a man named Keene, banked the chopper along a seldom surveyed cliff face on Shasta's west quadrant. The monitor tech, bored from hours of barren screen and glacial runoff, leaned closer to the feed. There, lodged against a sheer granite bluff where the angle alone defied physics, was a glint of blue. Not sky blue, manufactured blue, faded nylon, sagging in the wind like a sail long forgotten. They marked the coordinates, returned to base, logged the data like any other anomaly. But a ranger at the dispatch station caught the footage later that afternoon. Raphael Brigg, a stoic man with 20 years under the Forest Service, saw the tent immediately. His heart quickened not because it was strange, but because it was familiar. That curve, that color. He had held the flyer in his hands nearly a decade ago. He knew that gear. He didn't speak. He picked up his personal scope, drove 6 miles to a ridge with a line of sight on the GPS tag, and sat under a sun that now seemed too bright. Through the magnification, he saw the truth. A dome tent wedged into a ledge no climber should have accessed without a rope team and anchors. No path led in. No markings surrounded it. The tent was sun-bleached, with one flap torn and fluttering like a warning. It was perched above a 300-foot drop of broken basalt and dust. Brigg steadied the scope and whispered aloud, though no one was near. Impossible. He didn't go home that night. Within 24 hours, a response unit was assembled. The Forest Service, Search and Rescue, and the County Forensics Office coordinated a climb. It was not a rescue. It was a recovery. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. The tent had survived almost a decade of snow, sun, and wind. Whoever placed it there had not descended. They had not called for help. They had not moved. At 4:00, the team departed. The base was still shadowed and cold when they roped in. The climb was technical, savage even in good weather. Ice tools clinked against rock, and the scree shifted with each foothold, threatening to collapse beneath their weight. One misstep, and the team would follow the ghosts they sought. But they moved methodically, checking anchors, measuring heartbeats, and ascending the cliff that had, for 9 years, hidden the final chapter of someone's life. The ledge was narrower than the aerial footage suggested, maybe 4 feet wide. The tent had been lashed to a cluster of fractured rock, its poles bent from storms. One side had collapsed, revealing the dark shape inside 2 sleeping bags, zipped together, and beneath one, bone. They froze. The wind shifted. No one spoke. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. They entered the tent, slowly, methodically. Photographs were taken, every angle documented. No sudden movements. The body inside was mostly skeletal, preserved more by cold than by shelter. No animals had disturbed it, not here. A single boot remained on a curled foot. A stove, rusted shut, sat beside a cracked water bottle. And at the far end of the tent, half tucked into the seam of the nylon wall, a notebook. Waterlogged, fragile, but the words were legible. A storm blew in. Visibility 0. No way down. Staying put. We'll wait 2 days. We're okay. It was dated 9 years ago. The handwriting was shaky, but calm, rational. The ink had bled slightly in the damp, but the signature below remained intact. Elena. The team leader whispered into the radio, "Confirm site. Remains present. Logging artifacts now." And the mountain stood silent. They packed the evidence with gloved hands, the notebook, the bags, the cooking pot, and the single wool hat still retaining the shape of a human head. When they were done, they built a cairn from nearby stones, placed it at the edge of the ledge, and began the descent. When they reached the base, Raphael Brigg was waiting. He did not speak as the evidence bags were loaded into the truck. He simply placed a hand on the cold nylon that had once been a home and nodded. Somewhere behind his eyes, the image of Elena Maddox and Peter Hale, zipped into a final sleep on a wall no one should have found, etched itself into permanence. The code call went out from his radio. Package secured. Site clear. Notify families. The long silence had ended, but the story had just begun. The notification came just past dawn. 2 houses, 2 lives separated by hundreds of miles, received the same call within minutes of each other. One in Reading, where Elena's mother still lived in the same small craftsman home her daughter had grown up in. The other was on the edge of Bend, Oregon, where Peter's brother worked nights and answered with a groggy hello that turned into breathless silence as the words reached him. "There's been a discovery. We believe we've located their final campsite. Nothing more. Not yet. Just the outline of a confirmation that had waited 9 years to be spoken." Elena's mother, Celeste, didn't cry. She nodded quietly to no one and walked out to her garden. The asters had bloomed 2 weeks too early that year. She crouched beside them and began pulling weeds, her hands shaking but methodical, each motion echoing the hours she'd spent, distracting herself while the rest of the world moved on. Peter's brother, Nathan, sat at his kitchen table for nearly an hour, the phone still on, the line silent. Eventually he rose, made a pot of coffee he never drank, and retrieved the old laminated topo map Peter had marked up before that final climb. He unfolded it slowly, stared at the red X near the summit, and whispered, "I told you to take the southern ridge." News of the discovery didn't spread quickly. It wasn't splashed across headlines or rushed into broadcasts. The agencies involved handled it with the same reverent quiet that had marked the recovery itself. Families were notified. Forensics began cataloging. A spokesperson from the Forest Service, standing before a wall of muted microphones, offered only a brief statement. "A site believed to belong to the missing climbers, Elena Maddox and Peter Hale, has been located. Human remains have been recovered and are currently undergoing identification. No further comment at this time." Then, the podium was empty again. But silence doesn't stop speculation. On forums dedicated to mountaineering, true crime, and backcountry survival, the threads rekindled with a fury. Photographs of the tent location, blurred and pixelated, circulated like wildfire. Amateur sleuths dissected angles, questioned logistics, and speculated on how two highly skilled climbers could end up stranded on a shelf no one had ever mapped. The theories, once dormant and scattered, now reawakened with urgency. Some said it was a storm, just bad timing and worse luck. Others claimed they had found something they weren't supposed to. There were those who blamed the military testing range further east. Others invoked folklore, the old stories of disappearances on Shasta going back to the Modoc people. One user posted simply, "That mountain eats people." None of it mattered to the evidence. The forensics team worked with grim patience. The remains were partial but distinct, differentiated by slight variations in bone structure, dental records, and the preservation of what fabric remained in the sleeping bags. The notebook, once dried and reinforced by conservation experts, yielded not only the final message but also several earlier entries. They weren't diary entries in the traditional sense, just short field notes. Temperatures, wind speeds, food inventory, but tucked between the utilitarian scrawl were scattered impressions that revealed who Elena and Peter had been in those final days. Camped higher than expected. Sunset too beautiful to turn back. Peter says we should try for the saddle in the morning if the sky holds. Elena's humming again. Off key. She thinks I can't hear her through the wind. We haven't seen anyone in 2 days. It's strange Shasta's so quiet this season. Snow came fast. Visibility's gone. Staying put for now. She's calm. I'm calm. One entry included a small sketch, just a line drawing of the ridgeline they had camped beneath, with arrows pointing toward a lower plateau and a question mark written beside it. No caption, no explanation. But it would later haunt the investigators. As the lab work continued, the task force reopened its original files. Satellite data, weather logs, witness accounts. But nothing new presented itself. Nothing that explained how two experienced climbers had ended up trapped on an inaccessible ledge. No sign of panic. No effort to descend or seek help. No second set of footprints. No signs of foul play. They had simply waited and died. But one detail did emerge, subtle, easy to miss. In the original report from 2015, Elena had logged their route plan with the Ranger Station Standard Protocol. It matched their intended loop, Northgate Trail, Shasta Traverse, overnight near the summit plateau, and descent via the Avalanche Gulch. Conservative. Smart. But now, from the recovered journal, it was clear they had deviated. The note referencing a new approach was higher than expected. A short detour, perhaps, or a last-minute decision to chase a clearer view. Just a few hundred vertical feet. Just enough to vanish from view, from radio signal, from rescue. It was, as one ranger noted quietly in the margins of his briefing report, a tragic case of confidence meeting consequence. But not everyone agreed. A retired SAR coordinator named June Callie, who had led 3 of the original sweep efforts back in 2015, visited the new site herself after the discovery. She stared at the ledge, the tent, and the improbable precision with which it had been placed and secured. And she asked the question no one wanted to write down. How did they get up there? More importantly, why? The gear recovered showed no signs of ropes used at that elevation. No belay marks, no anchors. And the cliff beneath the ledge, once surveyed by drone, was deemed impassable without advanced aid climbing equipment, none of which had been brought. Either they had climbed in under perfect, unrepeatable conditions, or they had come from above, but even that seemed improbable. The shelf was so narrow, so exposed, that descending onto it would have been suicidal in the wind. Callie didn't make a formal statement. She never wrote a report. But before she left, she placed a single orange flag marker at the edge of the tent and whispered to the mountain, "You kept them safe. Now give us the rest." The wind answered with silence. And below, in the town of Mount Shasta, candles began to appear again in windows, not for hope, for remembrance. The medical examiner's report arrived in a plain envelope. No ceremony, no headlines. Just a sheaf of documents marked with case numbers and procedural language, stripped of any poetry or pathos. Inside, A summary of what was already expected: skeletal, remains consistent with prolonged exposure, no signs of trauma inconsistent with hypothermia and starvation, no defensive wounds, no fractures suggesting a fall. The cause of death is listed simply as environmental exposure, contributory malnutrition. It was, in the most technical terms, a clean death. But nothing about it felt clean. Because clean doesn't explain the silence. Clean doesn't explain the stillness. Clean doesn't explain why two people, young and skilled, with gear and maps in time, laid down in a tent zipped together and waited for a sky that never cleared. What the examiner did confirm, however, was that they likely died within 48 hours of the last journal entry. It was dated October 11th. The ranger logs from that week reported an incoming front on the 12th, fast-moving and unseasonably harsh. Winds that reached 50 knots. Visibility down to 10 feet. Temperatures plunging below zero. They hadn't made it past the storm's first breath. They had waited, as planned. Then, likely in the middle of the second night, drifted into a sleep that never ended. It should have closed the case. Officially, it did. But unofficially, there were still too many questions. The location, for one. No one could explain the logistics of it. Climbers returned to that section of the range and tried to trace a hypothetical route to the ledge. None succeeded. The ascent was jagged, unstable, and without a known approach that didn't risk collapse. One team documented their attempt via drone footage. The rock face shimmered with loose shale, each foothold a potential death sentence. They stopped 40 feet below the tent and turned back, visibly shaken. Then there was the tent itself. When analyzed in the forensic lab, soil samples taken from its base revealed something unusual. Volcanic grit and wind-blown pumice from a field several miles east, nowhere near their logged route, and nowhere near the ledge. It was the kind of detail that might have meant nothing, a coincidence, a wind event. But for those who'd tracked the storm maps from that week, it raised new complications. The wind had come from the west. The gear inside the tent also told a story, but one that blurred more than clarified. A fuel canister, nearly full, water filter unused, a ration pack unopened. These were not the artifacts of a survivalist scraping by. These were the signs of a planned, patient wait. A wait that either ended too quickly or was never meant to end at all. The notebook remained the most personal artifact. After the initial scan, the lab released copies to the families. Most of it was weather data, field sketches, and mundane tracking notes. But a handful of lines, now unspooled from the fabric of grief and hindsight, took on a darker shade. Elena says we should stay until the stars come back. She says the mountain has moods. Woke up at 3:15 a.m. I thought I heard bells. Not wind, not animals. No footprints today. Still just us. Still just us. They could be read 100 ways, but context is a mirror. What you see depends on what you bring with you. To Celeste Maddox, they were evidence of a daughter staying calm, staying practical, and staying anchored in routine. To Nathan Hale, they were signs of fraying control, of isolation wearing down Peter's resolve. And to some, the bloggers, the podcasters, the Reddit analysts, they were something else entirely. Because Mount Shasta has a reputation, not just as a geographic marvel or climber's paradise, but as something older and stranger, a magnet for myth. For centuries, stories have surrounded its slopes like mist legends of lost civilizations beneath its peaks, of disappearances that predate modern mapping, of lights seen through clouds and shapes glimpsed just beyond rational sight. Even in contemporary lore, it remains a site of mystery. UFO sightings, missing time accounts. Entire internet subcultures revolve around the so-called Shasta phenomena. Normally, those stories stay on the margins. But now, with Elena and Peter's final location bordering on the impossible, even the skeptics found themselves asking, was there something else? Not something fantastical, but something unexplained. One retired geologist who'd worked the region in the 90s offered his take in a quietly published journal entry. There are magnetic anomalies along the west slope of Shasta that haven't been charted properly. Instruments fail. Compass needles swing erratically. Satellite signals get lost or warped. It's not mystical. It's geology. But it's also real. He went on to suggest that what some interpret as folklore might actually be the lived experience of disoriented climbers, especially in poor visibility, navigating a mountain whose magnetism literally shifts perception. A trick of the terrain. A betrayal by the very tools meant to ensure survival. But even that couldn't explain the absence of decent attempts, the lack of distress signals, the eerie stillness. One SAR volunteer who had helped recover the tent described it this way in an anonymous interview. "I've seen exposure deaths before. Panic, thrashing. People try to claw their way out. It's a mess. But this? It was like they just accepted it. Like they knew. That's what stayed with me. The stillness. And there, perhaps, lies the most haunting truth. Not in the death itself, but in the posture of it. In the silence of a zip tent, perched where no tent should be, under stars, no longer visible. In two sleeping bags joined as one, not torn or scattered. In the final note, which ends not with desperation or despair, but with a strange, aching calm. We're okay. It echoed like a memory, not a scream, not a plea, but a whisper across the rocks, carried by the wind to the ledge where the mountain had been waiting all along. When the Forest Service cleared the site, they took only what was necessary for evidence. The tent was left behind, lashed tight to the rock, sun-bleached and fragile. It remains there to this day, a silent monument to two lives that touched the sky and then faded into it. Few climb that section now. Those who do rarely speak of what they see near the ledge, if anything. But one climber, years later, scrawled a note on the register at North Gate Trail. "It felt like I wasn't alone up there." Wind said nothing, but it watched. The town of Weed sits just south of Mount Shasta's base, a cluster of modest homes and weathered storefronts, buffeted by decades of pine dust and highway wind. It's a place where people know the mountain not as a myth, but as a presence, a constant silhouette beyond the grocery store, the school bus stop, and the gas station sign. Elena's mother moved there in the late 90s. She'd come for clean air and quiet, found both, and never left. When her daughter went missing, she told reporters she couldn't look at the mountain anymore. "It used to feel like home," she said softly. "Now it feels like a grave." But even grief needs a form. And in the absence of answers, theories took root like moss in silence. There were the practical ones first. Wrong turn, bad weather, hypothermia. Then, the speculative. Disorientation, hallucination from altitude sickness, and even foul play. But none of them fit the physical evidence. There were no external injuries, no signs of a struggle, no other footprints. The tent had not been disturbed. It was as if Elena and Peter had walked deliberately into their own ending. They hadn't been impulsive thrill-seekers. Peter had completed high-altitude climbs in Bolivia and Nepal. Elena had once given a TEDx talk at her college about alpine risk and cognitive mapping under stress. These were not novices. They knew what to expect. And yet somewhere above the tree line, surrounded by all the tools they needed to survive, they stopped. Some began to wonder if they had intended it, a kind of planned stillness, a pact. But then why bring the food? Why pack fuel? Why leave a message that sounded so hopeful? "We're okay." That line, repeated in interviews and on podcasts, even etched into the wood of a park bench by a hiker passing through the North Gate Trail, took on a life of its own. It became a cipher, a final signal, an echo that offered more confusion than clarity. Had it been a reassurance meant for loved ones? A lie told to themselves? Or was it exactly what it seemed? A calm acknowledgement of something unknown, and now unknowable. Back in Weed, Elena's mother, now gray-haired and gaunt from years of waiting, was offered the notebook. She declined to keep it. "I'd rather remember her voice," she said, "than read what the mountain let survive." Peter's brother, a firefighter from Eugene, Oregon, accepted it instead. He read it once, then sealed it in a safety deposit box. "People think a notebook is a window," he said. "But it's really a mirror. You see what you need to see." In the months that followed the discovery, Public attention surged and waned. Like all tragedies in the digital age, YouTubers made animations. TikToks mapped the path. Reddit threads dissected the notebook line by line. Theories multiplied, some respectful, some lurid. Photos of the tent leaked, then satellite coordinates. A drone hobbyist posted high-resolution imagery of the site before federal agencies intervened and took it down, but not before hundreds downloaded it, pinned it, and marked it. A myth was being born in real time. One local ranger, interviewed anonymously for a documentary that was never released, described it like this: "People come here now looking for ghosts. They don't climb to reach the summit, they climb to touch the place where silence won." And silence had won. Not just the literal stillness of death, but a deeper, metaphysical quiet, the absence of motive, of a why. Search and rescue teams often speak about closure as a myth, that you don't solve disappearances, you just find what's left. But in this case, what was left gave only more questions. Why had they set up camp on an exposed ledge instead of descending when the weather turned? Why was their route mapped and rehearsed abandoned entirely? Why leave gear behind that might have saved them? Why settle into a tent against a sheer cliff face when safer ground lies just an hour below? The notebooks, the position of the bodies, even the condition of the tent all pointed to deliberate decisions, not frantic ones, not panicked or improvised, but careful, lucid, and final. A retired psychologist who had worked with military survivalists reviewed the details and noted something chilling. What makes this case disturbing is not the presence of chaos, but its absence. Survivors often act irrationally under stress, but here we see none of that. No desperation, just stillness. There's an eerie discipline to it, like they accepted something we can't see. The phrase circulated through niche forums, the discipline of stillness. An essayist for a mountain journal wrote, "They died in harmony with something that doesn't want to be known." And beneath those words, the comment thread ran hundreds deep, some invoking faith, others science, others still some older knowledge that has no place in peer-reviewed journals. One user, anonymous and succinct, typed only, "The mountain took them back." For all the theories, the case remained officially closed. No further investigations, no criminal involvement, no additional remains. The evidence was cataloged, stored, and sealed. But the mountain had changed. Or perhaps those who viewed it had. What had once been a summit goal became, for many, a kind of shrine. Visitors began leaving things at Northgate Trailhead. Small rocks arranged into spirals, tattered pages with names of the missing, lanterns, unlit, even a pair of hiking boots, laced and upright, pointing north. A quiet tradition emerged among climbers who passed through the area. They would leave something behind: a button, a strip of cloth, a name scratched into bark, not out of superstition, but out of respect. As if to say, "We saw what you left, and we remember." In the end, Elena and Peter became more than themselves. Not heroes, not victims, but a story, one that felt older than their names, older even than the search. A modern parable wrapped in nylon and silence, told by wind and snow and notebooks that outlast memory. Somewhere, the tent still clings to that ledge, storm-battered, sun-drained, fragile, and inside it, perhaps, a sliver of peace. Or maybe a question so vast it can't be spoken aloud. Whatever they found up there, they never came back. And maybe that's the only truth the mountain allows us to keep. Summer returned to the slopes of Mount Shasta with its usual quiet contradiction: green meadows pushing through scree, dragonflies flickering above meltwater pools, and the high hum of wind threading the air like a held breath. But that year, the mountain felt different, not altered in shape or size, but in weight, as if something had been unearthed, not just a tent or a story, but a presence that would now live in the folds of the ridgeline, forever watching. The tent was never retrieved. The Forest Service deemed the site too dangerous for extraction. Any attempt to recover it would risk further climbers' lives, and so it remained, lashed to stone, one flap torn to ribbons by wind. A kind of shrine, yes, but also a warning. a marker not of death but of choice. It existed on no official map and was mentioned in no guidebook, but those who needed to know found it. One by one, small cairns began to appear along the lesser-used paths approaching the west face. They weren't stacked at trail junctions or scenic overlooks. They were placed along the ridgelines, far from where tourists wandered, and always, they pointed toward the ledge. Among seasoned climbers and solitude seekers, it became an unspoken rite: the long approach, the silent vigil, and the quiet return. No selfies, no names, just stillness. Some left notes folded under rocks, others a strip of shirt or a snapped climbing buckle. No one touched the tent. That was understood. Back in town, local officials debated whether to post warning signs: trail closed beyond this point, or unstable terrain, hazardous conditions. But ultimately, they chose silence. Not out of neglect, but reverence. The mountain was speaking in its own language, and bureaucratic signs could not translate it. Elena's mother never returned to Shasta. She moved south, closer to her sister. She gave interviews only once, 6 months after the discovery. The journalist described her as calm, careful, and already halfway gone. When asked what she thought had happened, she paused, then said, "I think they reached a place most people are too afraid to see." And they stayed there. Peter's brother returned once, that same summer. He hiked as close as he could without roping in, then sat on a boulder until the sun dipped behind the summit. He didn't try to reach the ledge. He didn't want to. "It's not for us anymore," he said quietly when a passing hiker asked if he needed directions. For those in the recovery team, the memory of that day never faded. Not because of the climb or the discovery, but because of the silence. There was no panic in the air, one team member wrote later. No sense of tragedy. It was like we walked into a moment that had already finished echoing. The team had trained for disaster, for broken limbs, for frostbitten fingers, for the screams of survivors. But what they found was stillness, complete and absolute. For Raphael Brigg, the ranger who first spotted the tent, it became something deeper. He visited the ridge often in the following months, sometimes alone, sometimes with trainees. But never with reporters, never with tourists. The mountain, he said, had offered him a message, not closure, but clarity. "We forget," he once wrote in a private journal, later released posthumously, "that silence is not absence. It's presence, just a different kind." He died 3 years later, not on the mountain, but in his sleep, surrounded by family. At his funeral, a fellow ranger read aloud from his journal. The passage chosen was not about tragedy or search efforts, but about peace. Some places, Brigg had written, are not meant to be crossed, only acknowledged. You stand at their edge, listen to their hush, and understand that mystery is not something broken to be solved, but something whole to be honored. It was a sentiment that rippled through the climbing community. A mural was painted on the back wall of a gear shop in Redding, a silhouette of a tent against a cliffside, 2 headlamps glowing faintly inside. No words, no names, just the outline of reverence. Meanwhile, students at Peter's old university created a memorial installation, 2 vertical glass panes etched with quotes from the notebook found at the site. One side read, "Storm blew in, visibility 0. The other, "We're okay." The glass was intentionally left unframed, standing exposed on a grassy quad where wind could whistle between them. "Let the silence speak," the artist's note read. Elena's alma mater, a small liberal arts college on the coast, launched a scholarship for women in wilderness research. It was named not after her death, but her curiosity. "For those who walk paths, others avoid," the inscription read. But perhaps the most haunting legacy came not from institutions, but from whispers. Among the locals who grew up in the shadow of Mount Shasta, a new phrase entered the quiet vernacular. The ledge, they called it, not as a destination, but a state, a metaphor. A teenager caught skipping school and found alone at Castle Lake told the ranger, "I wasn't going to jump or anything. I just needed a ledge." A mother, asked why her daughter no longer hiked, shrugged and said, "She had a ledge year. She's better now." And in hushed tones between guides and soloists, and those who know the mountain, not as a hobby but as a companion, the word held power. "Careful out there," one would say before a climb. "Not every ledge wants you back." It was more than poetry. It was belief. Because in the end, the mystery of Elena and Peter was not how they died but how they stayed, how they chose deliberately, perhaps quietly, to remain. And in doing so, they reminded the world that not all stories end in explanation. Some end in place, in stillness, in the hush of wind and stone and time. They vanished, yes, but they were also found, not just in remains or notebooks or artifacts, but in every pair of eyes that scans the summit and sees more than granite. In every breathless moment when the trail narrows and the clouds descend and the wind carries something older than fear. In those moments, the mountain speaks. And now we know to listen. The notebook found in the tent was eventually transported to the state forensics lab, not out of a need to question its contents, but to preserve them. The pages, delicate and water-stained, were handled like artifacts from another era. Each sentence was scanned, catalogued, and then sealed behind archival glass. The words had been written in graphite, and yet they pulsed with something deeper, something that felt etched into the paper itself. There were no goodbyes, no last testaments or proclamations of fear. The tone was practical, observational, but between the lines, the silence hung heavy. There were only 5 entries. The first confirmed the storm, the decision to wait it out, and a careful calculation of remaining supplies. The second marked the passing of 2 days with no break in the weather, visibility at 0. Wind relentless, batteries fading. The third noted that Peter had attempted to descend, but had returned after 20 minutes, reporting no visibility, no terrain markers, and dangerous ice. "Not safe. Will stay," the entry read. The fourth contained fewer words. "Still snowing. Losing sense of time. No voices but ours. Rations low." The final entry, dated approximately 9 days after their start, read, "Sun today, but too late. Weak. No more climbing. Staying together." That was all. No mention of death. No note to loved ones. Only a kind of eerie, pragmatic stillness. It was not the diary of someone panicking. It was not written in desperation. It was composed like a field journal, detached, rational. And that, perhaps, was what made it so difficult to read. The calm tone offered no foothold for grief, no catharsis, just the reality of 2 people making a decision and living in it until they couldn't anymore. The notebook's last page bore a faint imprint where a pen had pressed hard, possibly scratched out, possibly a final thought abandoned. Investigators could not decipher it. But its presence became emblematic of the story as a whole, something unspoken, just beneath the surface, forever unreachable. Psychologists who reviewed the entries noted a striking absence of fear. "This wasn't written by someone who believed they were about to die," one commented. "It was written by someone who believed they could still wait it out. That rescue might come. That staying still was safer than the alternative." But the rescue never came. The storm that buried them had been the worst in 8 years, recorded as a terrain-cloaking whiteout event in the seasonal weather logs. At its peak, visibility on the upper flanks of Mount Shasta dropped below 2 feet. Ice accumulated so quickly that even experienced climbers were stranded at base camps. Helicopter searches were impossible during those days, and the team sent by foot had turned back before reaching the western quadrant. Their ledge, narrow and sheltered from aerial view, had remained hidden beneath both weather and timing. It wasn't failure that left them there. It was the mountain silence. In the wake of the discovery, theories evaporated. The whispers that had lingered for years of secret caves, of foul play, of cults, or of disappearances orchestrated by choice dissolved under the weight of quiet evidence. There had been no crime, no abduction, no wilderness trickery, just a storm, just a cliff, Just two people who had planned for everything except the one thing they could not outrun. And yet, some questions remained. Why had they taken the full pack to that ledge? Why hadn't they signaled, left more obvious markers, or attempted a different descent? Those closest to the case offered one theory. The ledge may not have been their original destination, but a temporary shelter, a place chosen in the chaos of descending visibility and unstable terrain. A place that became permanent not by design, but by the collapsing of options. When the map fades, one ranger said, you don't keep walking. You stay where the last line was clear. The notebook's existence confirmed one thing. They had chosen stillness, and in doing so, they had created a fixed point in the vast, unraveling tapestry of the mountain. For the families, that point became a kind of pivot. Elena's sister, Mariana, flew out from Oregon to attend the forensics briefing. She sat quietly through the presentation of artifacts, the sleeping bags, the stove, and the boot. When it ended, she requested a moment alone with the tent. The room was cleared. No one knows what she did or said in those minutes, but when she emerged, she carried with her only the notebook. She held it to her chest like a living thing. Later that week, she published a short essay in an outdoor journal. It was titled The Last Camp, and it was less about grief than presence. We imagine death as a moment, she wrote. But maybe it's a space, a place, a choice made 1 hour at a time while the wind whispers above your tent. Maybe the mountain didn't take them. Maybe it held them. The essay spread quietly but widely. It was not shared in the way viral posts usually are. It was passed along like a story around a fire, quietly forwarded between climbers, park rangers, and those who had known solitude in the backcountry, the kind of people who understood that silence has shape, that not all tragedies are failures of will, that sometimes staying put is an act of incredible strength. Peter's parents declined all interviews, but in a letter later submitted to the search team, they wrote one sentence that echoed in the margins of many reports. They were not lost. They were found, only too late. The state officially closed the case 9 weeks after the recovery. The report cited the cause of death as hypothermia and exposure following extended entrapment due to severe alpine weather. The final paragraph noted, both individuals were well prepared, physically capable, and demonstrated appropriate decision-making within the constraints of the event. Their deaths were not due to recklessness or negligence, but to the unpredictable and overwhelming forces of nature. But long after the paperwork was filed, the story continued to unfold not on the news, but in whispers. On cold mornings, rangers still found footprints leading toward the west face, not fresh ones, ghost ones, tracks that stopped where the trail ended, where the trees thinned, where the sky opened wide and unforgiving. And always, there was the sense just beyond what could be measured that the mountain remembered, not in rage, not in sorrow, but in the soft hush of snow falling on stone. Waiting. In the weeks that followed the official recovery, the western quadrant of Mount Shasta became a place of quiet pilgrimage, not publicized, not formalized, just visited. Climbers, rangers, and even local townspeople began to make the journey to the overlook facing the ledge. They didn't go to stand above it. That route was treacherous, still unstable even in dry months. Instead, they came to view it from across the basin, where binoculars or scopes could bring the spot into faint clarity. A sliver of ledge, a splash of blue, a memory held in stone. They left tokens, not on the cliffside, which remained undisturbed by policy, but along the approach. At a certain juncture where the switchbacks opened to a view of the western face, small cairns began to appear. A worn glove, a ribbon tied to a pine branch, a photograph laminated in plastic. And, perhaps most poignantly, a second notebook, this one wrapped in waterproof canvas, placed in a weatherproof box, and chained to a stone. Visitors wrote messages, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. Most began the same way, to the ones who stayed. The Forest Service left the box alone. They checked it only to ensure it remained intact, but the notebook inside slowly filled with entries, messages of thanks, of sorrow, of reflection. Hikers who had themselves been lost for hours or days wrote of fear, of clarity, of kinship. One ranger, writing anonymously, simply scrawled, "I think about your tent every time the wind shifts." The site took on a strange duality. It became sacred, not because of what had happened there, but because of what had been left behind, a moment frozen in time, a record of humanity's fragile insistence to endure. The ledge itself, narrow, precarious, and remote, became a symbol not of defeat, but of presence. It had held them. It had not let them fall. Back in town, the story continued in smaller ways. At the general store in Weed, a framed photograph of Peter and Elena was placed near the counter. The photo had been taken months before their climb, showing the two of them seated on a fallen log, maps spread across their knees, mid-laugh. Below the frame, a small brass plate read, "They loved the mountain, and it loved them back." The woman who ran the store, a soft-spoken local named Joy, told customers that she had once sold Peter a replacement tent pole. He was careful, she said. Measured. He checked the length twice, and then he smiled. Not big, just content. When a traveler asked her if it made her sad to see the picture every day, she shook her head. "No," she said. "It makes me listen." Others felt the echo, too. Park employees reported more visitors, asking about survival training, about mountain weather, and about alternate descent plans. But these were not panicked questions. They were reverent, informed by a story that had touched something deeper than fear, a sense of boundary, of what the earth gives and what it does not. The university where Elena had once studied environmental science held a memorial lecture in her name. The speaker, a glaciologist, did not focus on her death but on her research, the work she had intended to resume once the climbing season ended. "We honor her not by mourning her final day," he said, "but by continuing what she began, understanding the rhythms of the land, the deep time beneath our feet." Peter's climbing group, a tight-knit team of 5, returned to Shasta the following season, not to ascend, just to camp near the base, to watch the sun rise, to stand quietly with a mountain that had once taken one of their own. One of them, Ari, a soft-spoken man who rarely gave interviews, later wrote a piece for a mountaineering journal. It was titled simply, "The Edge." In it, he described the moment when they arrived at the base of the west face and looked up. "There was no visible sign of the tent," he wrote. "Just stone and light. But we knew where it had been. We felt it in the stillness, as if the mountain had closed its eye again, but remembered what it had seen." The recovery site itself remained closed to the public. A team of geologists later confirmed that the ledge was no longer stable. The freeze-thaw cycles had widened fractures in the granite. One winter's heavy melt could shear the outcropping off entirely. It was only a matter of time. And yet, the mountain did not feel malicious. It felt vast, indifferent in its beauty, capable of cradling both life and memory in equal measure. One spring, a group of high school students participating in a wilderness education program left a wreath made of pine branches and alpine flowers at the overlook. They did not film it. They did not post about it online. They left it under a tree and kept walking. The silence remained. But it was a different silence now. Not the silence of absence. The silence of presence held in place. A presence that asked nothing in return. That did not call out. That did not vanish. Just stayed. For those who had searched, the answers were now complete. Not in the forensic sense. Not every movement had been mapped. Not every hour of those lost days accounted for, but in the way that mattered most. Peter and Elena had not disappeared. They had not been erased by conspiracy or darkness. They had been seen, found, named, and returned. And in that return, something shifted in the landscape of memory. People spoke their names now without a hush, not in whispers, but in full voice. They were no longer the vanished. They were the remembered. And the mountain, once inscrutable and withholding, now held the shape of a story. A story that continued in wind and ice and morning sun. A story that waited 9 years to be told. A story that, finally, could rest. The process of forensic analysis moved slowly, as it always does, because the past resists being reduced to facts. But piece by piece, the recovery team assembled a picture not of how Peter and Elena had lived, but of how they had chosen to face the final hours of their story. The sleeping bags zipped together, the notebook placed within arm's reach, the stove still primed with half-melted snow. These were not panic-stricken gestures. They were composed, intentional. Even at altitude, even with death at their doorstep, they had chosen order. Investigators found no signs of violence, no trauma beyond the brutal effects of exposure. The estimated time of death was consistent with the storm pattern that had swept through the region in October 9 years earlier, a system that arrived faster than forecasts predicted, cloaking the western face in whiteout conditions within hours. Interviews with meteorologists confirmed that a sudden drop in barometric pressure had created a pocket of high-intensity weather directly along their ascent route. No one could have predicted it. What baffled experts, however, was the placement of the tent. Its location was not listed on any known ascent line. No official or unofficial routes passed through that ledge. It wasn't a fallback shelter. It was off-path, remote even by alpine standards. The only viable explanation was that they had taken a detour, perhaps to avoid worsening weather, looking for shelter or stability in terrain that offered neither. But they had found something, a place to stop, a place to endure, however briefly. And in doing so, they had managed what most would consider impossible: survival in the face of zero chance. Not in years or months, but in moments, in the measured act of staying still, of choosing not to move again. Among the items recovered was a small digital camera. The battery was long dead, but when charged in the lab, its memory card revealed 15 images. Most were what you would expect: ice fields, ridgelines, and low clouds stitched across distant peaks. Elena in profile, squinting at a compass. Peter crouched near a boulder, calibrating his altimeter. But the final photo stood apart. It showed their tent from a few feet away, illuminated faintly in the gloom of gathering stormlight. The flap was closed, the poles bent slightly under wind, but the image wasn't bleak. It wasn't desperate. It was artful, centered, framed with care. Someone, likely Peter, had stepped back from the camp, raised the lens, and clicked the shutter as the first wave of snow swept across the stone. A record, not of fear, but of place. It was not a cry for help. It was a signature. One investigator said quietly that it felt like a message, a way to say, "We were here." When the families were notified of the details, they didn't weep in the way people expect. The tears had long since dried. The grief had metabolized into something harder to name. Peter's sister, Leah, accepted the remains with a stillness that made the coroner hesitate. When asked if she wanted to view the final photo, she said yes, but only once. She looked at it for 20 silent seconds, then handed the screen back and said, "That's him." Elena's father, an astrophysics professor from Oregon, traveled to Shasta a week after the public statement was issued. He stood alone at the overlook in the early morning. The ranger who had driven him up offered to wait, but he declined. "I've studied orbits," he said. "I understand what it means to vanish for a while." He stayed for 3 hours, just watching, just listening. When he returned, he left a small object at the trailhead, a silver compass, its needle still true. The media storm that followed was brief but intense. Headlines resurrected the story with phrases like "mystery solved" and "9-year disappearance cracked by storm cliff clue." But the coverage faded as quickly as it surged. There were no lawsuits, no scandals, and no theories of foul play to sustain the spectacle. The facts were haunting but conclusive. And so, the world moved on. But not everyone did. A local climber named Hannah, who had once trained under Peter during a wilderness leadership course, began writing a book, not a thriller, not an exposé, but a personal meditation. She titled it The Ledge, borrowing the name that had come to define their final resting place. In it, she wrote not just about Peter and Elena, but about the paradox of search. "We look," she wrote, "not always to find, but to keep someone from becoming legend. As long as we search, they remain real. The manuscript circulated quietly. No bestseller list, no TV deal. But it reached the inboxes of those who needed it most. Rangers, SAR teams, and family members of the missing. People for whom the line between presence and absence had thinned beyond repair. And the ledge, though technically inaccessible, remained present, not on maps, but in memory, described in whispers, pointed at from trail turns, respected. The mountain, for its part, gave nothing more. It had offered the tent, the notebook, the photo. It had returned Peter and Elena, not to life, but to story, to continuity. And that was all it would give. Snow returned by mid-November. The cliff face whitened. The ledge disappeared again beneath layers of rime and silence. But those who had seen it never quite forgot the shape of that blue dome, clinging to stone like a heart that had chosen, despite all odds, to keep beating for just one more night. And somewhere in that stillness, in that impossible defiance, something sacred had been written, not in words, but in presence. Not a grave, not an altar, but a testament to love, to endurance, to the brutal grace of staying. It was not long before others began to refer to the place with reverence, almost unwillingly. The Shasta camp, some called it. Others simply call it the ledge. Not an official designation, not something one could search on a map, but a presence. A hidden geometry in the collective mind of a small, shaken community of rangers, climbers, and volunteers who had once combed the slopes for any sign of Peter and Elena. Now they spoke of that ledge the way one speaks of sacred ground, not loudly and never lightly. When the last forensic team descended and the final reports were filed away, a quiet protocol was proposed, one not written into law but honored nonetheless. No one was to speak publicly of the GPS coordinates, not out of secrecy, but respect. The wilderness, they argued, had offered its truth at its own pace. To exploit it would be a betrayal. It had taken 9 winters for the mountain to surrender its dead. It was not for the living to turn it into a spectacle. The ledge remained untouched. But from time to time, when the snow receded in early summer, an individual would approach the ridgeline never too close, always from below. They would pause, binoculars in hand, and scan the cliff face until they found the faint discoloration in the rock where the tent had once been lashed. Then they would bow their heads, not in prayer, but in something like it, a silent recognition, a confirmation that in this harshest of places, 2 people had chosen one another and held fast until the end. In the months that followed the recovery, a memorial was quietly installed at the base of the mountain. It wasn't grand. Just a slab of granite, polished, smooth, embedded into a low stone wall near the Stringer trailhead. No names etched into the front, no photos. Just an inscription, concise and oddly poetic, chosen by Elena's mother after weeks of thought. They faced the summit and did not turn away. Visitors came. Some stopped, some didn't. But those who read the words often lingered longer than they expected, as if the meaning crept up on them from behind. And for Peter's father, the closure meant something else entirely. A former Navy signal technician, he had for years refused to accept that his son was gone without a trace. "There's always something," he'd told journalists, back when people were still asking. "Radio waves, debris, evidence. The world doesn't just erase people." When the call came when the officials confirmed that his son had been found, he went silent for almost a full minute. Then he said, simply, he stayed. It was not what he expected to say, but it was true. Peter, the climber who had once summited Denali with a fractured wrist and refused airlift. Elena, the artist who had documented glacial collapse with reverent, almost liturgical precision. They had not run. They had not abandoned hope in haste. They had stayed together in a place no one should have reached and endured a storm no one could have predicted. It was an end, yes, but not a defeat. Later, officials would speculate that they had hunkered down during the initial gale, believing the storm would pass. The tent was reinforced. Their gear, despite the exposure, had been sufficient for a 2-day hold. But the weather didn't lift, and at some point perhaps that second night oxygen deprivation or sheer exhaustion overtook them. There were no signs of panic in the campsite, no collapsed poles, no torn fabric. The notebook offered no final goodbye, only facts. "We'll wait 2 days, we're okay." It was the last echo of their shared logic, their commitment to one another, and to the wilderness they had so loved. Not a cry for help, but a record, a decision made not in despair, but in clarity. In an age of constant surveillance and digital documentation, there was something almost unfathomable about their disappearance, and something even more impossible about the fact that they had been found, not by drones, not by algorithms, but by the trembling hand of chance and the slow, patient watching of one man through a ranger's scope. In a world that forgets quickly, their story endured, not because it shouted, but because it whispered for 9 years and was finally heard. A documentary was later proposed. A filmmaker from British Columbia had read about the discovery and reached out to both families, but the request was declined. Politely, firmly. "This wasn't a story about fear," Peter's sister wrote in her response. "It was a story about choice. And if we turn it into a spectacle, we erase that choice. Let the mountain hold some part of them. It was where they wanted to be." And so it did. The seasons returned, each one rewriting the upper ridges in snow and shadow. But below, the story remained fixed, rooted not in speculation or folklore, but in the evidence of things endured. A tent, a notebook, a photo of stillness in the face of chaos. People still climb Mount Shasta. They always will, and many of them, without knowing it, will pass beneath the very slope that cradled the ledge. They won't see it. They won't sense it. But it's there just above, just beyond, hidden by angles and silence. And some will stop at the base. They'll see the stone, read the words, and wonder. They'll imagine 2 figures rising into the orange light of a cold October morning, moving not in fear, but in harmony, matching pace, breathing the same thin air, and then turning toward the clouds that would close in, and choosing together not to turn away. Not toward safety, but toward one another, toward stillness, toward the ledge. Long after the reports had been filed, the bodies returned to their families, and the story faded from local headlines. A single photograph remained on the corkboard in Raphael Briggs' office. It wasn't from the scene, no forensic image, no document of grief or discovery. It was one taken months before the disappearance, sourced quietly by a volunteer after the initial search had begun to fade. In it, Peter and Elena stood near the tree line at Bunny Flat, the final staging point before Shasta's climb begins in earnest. They were dressed in layers, the kind built not just for weather but for endurance. Peter was half smiling, as if caught mid-thought. Elena had her hand on his arm, her other holding a thermos. Behind them, the mountain loomed not ominous, not threatening, but vast and unmovable, like a cathedral carved from the sky. Raphael never explained why he kept it pinned there. Others had moved on, rotated out of service, retired, but the image remained. Faded slightly at the edges from years of sunlight, the pushpin rusting at its corners. It had become less a photo and more a fixture, something elemental, like the maps or compass on his desk. A quiet reminder that every map had white space, and every white space once held something we didn't know was there. In the spring that followed the discovery, a small gathering was held near Lake Siskiyou. It wasn't advertised. Just family and a few friends, those who had shared a tent with Peter in summer, those who had taken workshops with Elena, learning to shoot 35mm film in the unforgiving blue light of dusk. A ranger spoke briefly. So did a teacher. Then silence fell, not empty, but sacred. Elena's mother placed a single item in the lake, a square of soft cotton cut from the lining of her daughter's sleeping bag, the one found still zipped beside Peter's. It floated for a moment before the current caught it, pulling it gently toward the center. It did not sink, not right away. It moved as if remembering something. then disappeared beneath the rippling water, carried west toward the snowmelt streams, then the Sacramento River, and eventually, the ocean. At the same time, Peter's brother stood farther upriver, near a bend where the cliffs mirrored the sky. He carried a second item, a sealed glass vial containing a scrap of the last notebook page. It had taken weeks to preserve. The ink, faint as breath, still bore the words, "Will wait 2 days." He crouched, pressed the vial into the sediment beneath a cairn of river stone, and covered it over. Not to hide it, but to give it back. Closure, people say, as if it's a door that shuts, a book that ends. But anyone who's ever lost someone knows that closure is not something you reach. It's something you learn to carry. Like elevation in your lungs, or silence in your bones. Years passed. The story of the Shasta climbers faded from public view. New tragedies arose. New names circulated. The mountain endured, impassive and unrepentant. Climbers still approached its flanks with reverence or arrogance. Most returned. A few didn't. But every so often, in ranger briefings or SAR trainings, the names Peter and Elena were whispered not as a cautionary tale, but as something more sacred. A recognition that the wilderness does not belong to us, and when it takes, it often does so not with malice, but with finality. That some who enter do not intend to return, not in failure, but in faith. That to walk into the storm is not always a mistake. Sometimes it is a vow. And in the low moments when storms rolled in and hope thinned, Raphael Brigg would still climb to that ridge, not to the ledge itself, never again, but to a spot just below, where the sun first cracked the eastern sky. From there the summit wasn't visible, but the path was, the one they must have followed that morning. Bootprints long erased, but direction eternal. He would sit there, scope folded in his lap, and let the mountain breathe around him, the wind through the white bark pines, the hush of melting snow, the deep silence that only high places carry. And in that stillness, he would remember. 2 figures, side by side, walking upward. The ridge, the turn, and then the vanishing. Not into fear, not into chaos, but into the kind of quiet that only love can make. The kind that asks nothing, explains nothing, and remains. Forever.